Today, in Audiobooks for Me, we are going to listen to The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. This book is divided in 3 videos. This is Part 2. We hope you enjoy it. Chapter 5. The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire. Holmes had read carefully a note which the last post had brought him. Then, with the dry chuckle, which was his nearest approach to a laugh, he tossed it over to me. For a mixture of the modern and the medieval, of the practical and of the wildly fanciful, this is surely the limit, said he. What do you make of it, Watson? I read as follows. 46, Old Jury, Northern 19th. Vampires. Sir, our client, Mr. Robert Ferguson of Ferguson and Muirhead, tea brokers of Mincing Lane, has made some inquiry from us in a communication of even date concerning vampires. As our firm specializes entirely upon the assessment of machinery, the matter hardly comes within our purview, and we have therefore recommended Mr. Ferguson to call upon you and lay the matter before you. We have not forgotten your successful action in the case of Matilda Briggs. We are, sir, faithfully yours, Morrison, and Dodd, per E.J.C. Matilda Briggs was not the name of a young woman, Watson, said Holmes in a reminiscent voice. It was a ship which is associated with the giant rat of Sumatra, a story for which the world is not yet prepared. But what do we know about vampires? Does it come within our purview either? Anything is better than stagnation, but really we seem to have been switched on to a Grimm's fairy tale. Make a long arm, Watson, and see what V has to say. I leaned back and took down the great index volume to which he referred. Holmes balanced it on his knee, and his eyes moved slowly and lovingly over the record of old cases, mixed with the accumulated information of a lifetime. Voyage of the Gloria Scott, he read. That was a bad business. I have some recollection that you made a record of it, Watson, though I was unable to congratulate you upon the result. Victor Lynch, the forger, venomous lizard or Gila. Remarkable case that. Vittoria, the circus belle, Vanderbilt and the Yeggman, Vipers, Vigor, the Hammersmith wonder. Hello, good old index. You can't beat it. Listen to this, Watson. Vampirism in Hungary. And again, vampires in Transylvania. He turned over the pages with eagerness, but after a short, intent perusal, he threw down the great book with a snarl of disappointment. Rubbish, Watson, rubbish! What have we to do with walking corpses who can only be held in their grave by stakes driven through their hearts? It's pure lunacy. But surely, said I, the vampire was not necessarily a dead man. A living person might have the habit. I have read, for example, of the old sucking the blood of the young in order to retain their youth. You are right, Watson. It mentions the legend in one of these references. But are we to give serious attention to such things? This agency stands flat-footed upon the ground, and there it must remain. The world is big enough for us. No ghosts need apply. I fear that we cannot take Mr. Robert Ferguson very seriously. Possibly this note may be from him and may throw some light upon what is worrying him. He took up a second letter, which had lain unnoticed upon the table, whilst he had been absorbed with the first. This he began to read with a smile of amusement upon his face, which gradually faded away into an expression of intense interest and concentration. When he had finished, he sat for some little time lost in thought, with the letter dangling from his fingers. Finally, with a start, he aroused himself from his reverie. Cheeseman's, Lamberley. Where is Lamberley, Watson? It is in Sussex, south of Horsham. Not very far, eh? And Cheeseman's? I know that country, Holmes. It is full of old houses which are named after the men who built them centuries ago. You get Audleys and Harveys and Carretons. The folk are forgotten, but their names live in houses. Precisely, said Holmes coldly. It was one of the peculiarities of his proud, self-contained nature that though he docketed any fresh information very quickly and accurately in his brain, he seldom made any acknowledgment to the giver. I rather fancy we shall know a good deal more about Cheeseman's Lamberley before we are through. The letter is, as I had hoped, from Robert Ferguson. By the way, he claims acquaintance with you. With me? You had better read it. He handed the letter across. It was headed with the address quoted. Dear Mr. Holmes, it said, I have been recommended to you by my lawyers, but indeed the matter is so extraordinarily delicate that it is most difficult to discuss. It concerns a friend for whom I am acting. This gentleman married some 5 years ago a Peruvian lady, the daughter of a Peruvian merchant, whom he had met in connection with the importation of nitrates. The lady was very beautiful, but the fact of her foreign birth and of her alien religion always caused a separation of interests and of feelings between husband and wife, so that after a time his love may have cooled towards her, and he may have come to regard their union as a mistake. He felt there were sides of her character which he could never explore or understand. This was the more painful as she was as loving a wife as a man could have, to all appearance absolutely devoted. And now for the point which I will make more plain when we meet. Indeed, this note is merely to give you a general idea of the situation and to ascertain whether you would care to interest yourself in the matter. The lady began to show some curious traits, quite alien to her ordinarily sweet and gentle disposition. The gentleman had been married twice, and he had one son by the first wife. This boy was now 15, a very charming and affectionate youth, though unhappily injured through an accident in childhood. Twice the wife was caught in the act of assaulting this poor lad in the most unprovoked way. Once she struck him with a stick and left a great weal on his arm. This was a small matter, however, compared with her conduct to her own child, a dear boy just under 1 year of age. On one occasion about a month ago, this child had been left by its nurse for a few minutes. A loud cry from the baby, as of pain, called the nurse back. As she ran into the room, she saw her employer, the lady, leaning over the baby and apparently biting his neck. There was a small wound in the neck, from which a stream of blood had escaped. The nurse was so horrified that she wished to call the husband, but the lady implored her not to do so and actually gave her £5 as a price for her silence. No explanation was ever given, and for the moment the matter was passed over. It left, however, a terrible impression upon the nurse's mind, and from that time she began to watch her mistress closely, and to keep a closer guard upon the baby, whom she tenderly loved. It seemed to her that even as she watched the mother, so the mother watched her, and that every time she was compelled to leave the baby alone, the mother was waiting to get at it. Day and night the nurse covered the child, and day and night the silent, watchful mother seemed to be lying in wait as a wolf waits for a lamb. It must read most incredible to you, and yet I beg you to take it seriously, for a child's life and a man's sanity may depend upon it. At last there came one dreadful day when the facts could no longer be concealed from the husband. The nurse's nerve had given way. She could stand the strain no longer, and she made a clean breast of it all to the man. To him it seemed as wild a tale as it may now seem to you. He knew his wife to be a loving wife, and save for the assaults upon her stepson, a loving mother. Why, then, should she wound her own dear little baby? He told the nurse that she was dreaming, that her suspicions were those of a lunatic, and that such libels upon her mistress were not to be tolerated. Whilst they were talking, a sudden cry of pain was heard. Nurse and master rushed together to the nursery. Imagine his feelings, Mr. Holmes, as he saw his wife rise from a kneeling position beside the cot and saw blood upon the child's exposed neck and upon the sheet. With a cry of horror, He turned his wife's face to the light and saw blood all round her lips. It was she beyond all question, who had drunk the poor baby's blood. So the matter stands. She is now confined to her room. There has been no explanation. The husband is half demented. He knows, and I know, little of vampirism beyond the name. We had thought it was some wild tale of foreign parts, and yet here in the very heart of the English Sussex. Well, all this can be discussed with you in the morning. Will you see me? Will you use your great powers in aiding a distracted man? If so, kindly wire to Ferguson, Cheesemans, Lamberley and I will be at your rooms by 10 o'clock. Yours faithfully, Robert Ferguson. P.S. I believe your friend Watson played rugby for Blackheath when I was 3/4 for Richmond. It is the only personal introduction which I can give. Of course I remember him, said I, as I laid down the letter. Big Bob Ferguson, the finest 3/4 Richmond ever had. He was always a good-natured chap. It's like him to be so concerned over a friend's case. Holmes looked at me thoughtfully and shook his head. I never get your limits, Watson, said he. There are unexplored possibilities about you. Take a wire down, like a good fellow. We'll examine your case with pleasure. Your case. We must not let him think that this agency is a home for the weak-minded. Of course it is his case. Send him that wire and let the matter rest till morning. Promptly at 10 o'clock next morning, Ferguson strode into our room. I had remembered him as a long, slab-sided man with loose limbs and a fine turn of speed, which had carried him round many an opposing back. There is surely nothing in life more painful than to meet the wreck of a fine athlete whom one has known in his prime. His great frame had fallen in, his flaxen hair was scanty, and his shoulders were bowed. I fear that I roused corresponding emotions in him. "Hello, Watson," said he, and his voice was still deep and hearty. "You don't look quite the man you did when I threw you over the ropes into the crowd at the old deer park. I expect I have changed a bit also, but it's this last day or two that has aged me. I see by your telegram, Mr. Holmes, that it is no use my pretending to be anyone's deputy." "It is simpler to deal direct," said Holmes. "Of course it is. But you can imagine how difficult it is when you are speaking of the one woman whom you are bound to protect and help. What can I do? How am I to go to the police with such a story? And yet the kiddies have got to be protected. Is it madness, Mr. Holmes? Is it something in the blood? Have you any similar case in your experience? For God's sake, give me some advice, for I am at my wits' end." "Very naturally, Mr. Ferguson. Now sit here and pull yourself together and give me a few clear answers. I can assure you that I am very far from being at my wits' end, and that I am confident we shall find some solution. First of all, tell me what steps you have taken. Is your wife still near the children?" "We had a dreadful scene. She is a most loving woman, Mr. Holmes. If ever a woman loved a man with all her heart and soul, she loves me. She was cut to the heart that I should have discovered this horrible, this incredible secret. She would not even speak. She gave no answer to my reproaches, save to gaze at me with a sort of wild, despairing look in her eyes. Then she rushed to her room and locked herself in. Since then, she has refused to see me. She has a maid who was with her before her marriage, Dolores by name, a friend rather than a servant. She takes her food to her. Then the child is in no immediate danger? Mrs. Mason, the nurse, has sworn that she will not leave it night or day. I can absolutely trust her. I am more uneasy about poor little Jack, for, as I told you in my note, he has twice been assaulted by her. But never wounded. No, she struck him savagely. It is the more terrible as he is a poor little inoffensive cripple." Ferguson's gaunt features softened as he spoke of his boy. "You would think that the dear lad's condition would soften anyone's heart. A fall in childhood and a twisted spine, Mr. Holmes. But the dearest, most loving heart within. Holmes had picked up the letter of yesterday and was reading it over. "What other inmates are there in your house, Mr. Ferguson?" "Two servants who have not been long with us. One stable hand, Michael, who sleeps in the house, myself, my boy Jack, baby Dolores, and Mrs. Mason. That is all. I gather that you did not know your wife well at the time of your marriage?" "I had only known her a few weeks." "How long had this maid Dolores been with her?" "Some years." "Then your wife's character would really be better known by Dolores than by you?" "Yes, you may say so." Holmes made a note. "I fancy," said he, "that I may be of more use at Lamberley than here. It is eminently a case for personal investigation. If the lady remains in her room, our presence could not annoy or inconvenience her. Of course, we would stay at the inn." Ferguson gave a gesture of relief. "It is what I hoped, Mr. Holmes. There is an excellent train at 2 from Victoria, if you could come." "Of course we could come. There is a lull at present. I can give you my undivided energies. Watson, of course, comes with us, but there are 1 or 2 points upon which I wish to be very sure before I start. This unhappy lady, as I understand it, has appeared to assault both the children, her own baby and your little son?" "That is so. But the assaults take different forms, do they not? She has beaten your son." "Once with a stick, and once very savagely with her hands." "Did she give no explanation why she struck him?" "None, save that she hated him. Again and again she said so." "Well, that is not unknown among stepmothers. A posthumous jealousy, we will say. Is the lady jealous by nature?" "Yes, she is very jealous, jealous with all the strength of her fiery tropical love." "But the boy, he is 15, I understand, and probably very developed in mind, since his body has been circumscribed in action. Did he give you no explanation of these assaults?" "No. He declared there was no reason." "Were they good friends at other times?" "No. There was never any love between them." "Yet you say he is affectionate?" "Never in the world could there be so devoted a son. My life is his life. He is absorbed in what I say or do." Once again, Holmes made a note. For some time, he sat lost in thought. "No doubt you and the boy were great comrades before this second marriage. You were thrown very close together, were you not?" "Very much so." "And the boy, having so affectionate a nature, was devoted, no doubt, to the memory of his mother?" "Most devoted." "He would certainly seem to be a most interesting lad. There is one other point about these assaults. Were the strange attacks upon the baby and the assaults upon your son at the same period?" "In the first case it was so. It was as if some frenzy had seized her, and she had vented her rage upon both. In the second case, it was only Jack who suffered. Mrs. Mason had no complaint to make about the baby." "That certainly complicates matters." "I don't quite follow you, Mr. Holmes." "Possibly not. One forms provisional theories and waits for time or fuller knowledge to explode them. A bad habit, Mr. Ferguson, but human nature is weak. I fear that your old friend here has given an exaggerated view of my scientific methods. However, I will only say at the present stage that your problem does not appear to me to be insoluble, and that you may expect to find us at Victoria at 2 o'clock. It was evening of a dull, foggy November day when, having left our bags at the Chequers, Lamberley, we drove through the Sussex clay of a long, winding lane, and finally reached the isolated and ancient farmhouse in which Ferguson dwelt. It was a large, straggling building, very old in the centre, very new at the wings, with towering Tudor chimneys and a lichen-spotted high-pitched roof of Horsham slabs. The doorsteps were worn into curves, and the ancient tiles which lined the porch were marked with the rebus of a cheese and a man, after the original builder. Within, the ceilings were corrugated with heavy oaken beams, and the uneven floors sagged into sharp curves. An odor of age and decay pervaded the whole crumbling building. There was one very large central room into which Ferguson led us. Here, in a huge old-fashioned fireplace with an iron screen behind it dated 1670, there blazed and spluttered a splendid log fire. The room, as I gazed round, was a most singular mixture of dates and of places. The half-panelled walls may well have belonged to the original yeoman farmer of the 17th century. They were ornamented, however, on the lower part by a line of well-chosen modern watercolours, while above, where yellow plaster took the place of oak, there was hung a fine collection of South American utensils and weapons, which had been brought, no doubt, by the Peruvian lady upstairs. Holmes rose with that quick curiosity which sprang from his eager mind and examined them with some care. He returned with his eyes full of thought. "Hullo!" he cried. "Hullo!" A spaniel had lain in a basket in the corner. It came slowly forward towards its master, walking with difficulty. Its hind legs moved irregularly, and its tail was on the ground. It licked Ferguson's hand. "What is it, Mr. Holmes?" "The dog. What's the matter with it?" That's what puzzled the vet. A sort of paralysis. Spinal meningitis, he thought. But it is passing. He'll be all right soon, won't you, Carlo? A shiver of assent passed through the drooping tail. The dog's mournful eyes passed from one of us to the other. He knew that we were discussing his case. Did it come on suddenly? In a single night. How long ago? It may have been 4 months ago. Very remarkable, very suggestive. What do you see in it, Mr. Holmes? A confirmation of what I had already thought. For God's sake, what do you think, Mr. Holmes? It may be a mere intellectual puzzle to you, but it is life and death to me. My wife, a would-be murderer. My child in constant danger. Don't play with me, Mr. Holmes. It is too terribly serious. The big rugby three-quarter was trembling all over. Holmes put his hand soothingly upon his arm. "I fear that there is pain for you, Mr. Ferguson, whatever the solution may be," said he. "I would spare you all I can. I cannot say more for the instant, but before I leave this house, I hope I may have something definite." "Please, God, you may. If you will excuse me, gentlemen, I will go up to my wife's room and see if there has been any change." He was away some minutes, during which Holmes resumed his examination of the curiosities upon the wall. When our host returned, it was clear from his downcast face that he had made no progress. He brought with him a tall, slim, brown-faced girl. "The tea is ready, Dolores," said Ferguson. "See that your mistress has everything she can wish." "She vera ill," cried the girl, looking with indignant eyes at her master. "She no ask for food. She vera ill. She need doctor. I frightened stay alone with her, without doctor." Ferguson looked at me with a question in his eyes. "I should be so glad if I could be of use. Would your mistress see Dr. Watson? I take him. I no ask leave. She needs doctor." "Then I'll come with you at once." I followed the girl, who was quivering with strong emotion, up the staircase and down an ancient corridor. At the end was an iron-clamped and massive door. It struck me as I looked at it that if Ferguson tried to force his way to his wife, he would find it no easy matter. The girl drew a key from her pocket, and the heavy oaken planks creaked upon their old hinges. I passed in, and she swiftly followed, fastening the door behind her. On the bed a woman was lying who was clearly in a high fever. She was only half conscious, but as I entered, she raised a pair of frightened but beautiful eyes and glared at me in apprehension. Seeing a stranger, she appeared to be relieved and sank back with a sigh upon the pillow. I stepped up to her with a few reassuring words, and she lay still while I took her pulse and temperature. Both were high and yet My impression was that the condition was rather that of mental and nervous excitement than of any actual seizure. "She lie like that one day, 2 day, I 'fraid she die," said the girl. The woman turned her flushed and handsome face towards me. "Where is my husband? He is below, and would wish to see you." "I will not see him. I will not see him." Then she seemed to wander off into delirium. "A fiend! A fiend! Oh, what shall I do with this devil?" "Can I help you in any way?" "No, no one can help. It is finished. All is destroyed. Do what I will, all is destroyed." The woman must have some strange delusion. I could not see honest Bob Ferguson in the character of fiend or devil. "Madam," I said, "your husband loves you dearly. He is deeply grieved at this happening." Again she turned on me those glorious eyes. "He loves me." "Yes, but do I not love him? Do I not love him even to sacrifice myself rather than break his dear heart? That is how I love him. And yet he could think of me. He could speak of me so. He is full of grief, but he cannot understand. No, he cannot understand. But he should trust." "Will you not see him?" I suggested. "No, no, I cannot forget those terrible words, nor the look upon his face. I will not see him. Go now. You can do nothing for me. Tell him only one thing. I want my child. I have a right to my child. That is the only message I can send him." She turned her face to the wall and would say no more. I returned to the room downstairs, where Ferguson and Holmes still sat by the fire. Ferguson listened moodily to my account of the interview. "How can I send her the child?" he said. "How do I know what strange impulse might come upon her? How can I ever forget how she rose from beside it with its blood upon her lips?" He shuddered at the recollection. "The child is safe with Mrs. Mason, and there he must remain." A smart maid, the only modern thing which we had seen in the house, had brought in some tea. As she was serving it, the door opened and a youth entered the room. He was a remarkable lad, pale-faced and fair-haired, with excitable light blue eyes, which blazed into a sudden flame of emotion and joy as they rested upon his father. He rushed forward and threw his arms round his neck with the abandon of a loving girl. "Oh, Daddy," he cried, "I did not know that you were due yet. I should have been here to meet you. Oh, I'm so glad to see you." Ferguson gently disengaged himself from the embrace with some little show of embarrassment. "Dear old chap," said he, patting the flaxen head with a very tender hand, "I came early because my friends, Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, have been persuaded to come down and spend an evening with us." "Is that Mr. Holmes, the detective?" "Yes." The youth looked at us with a very penetrating, and as it seemed to me, unfriendly gaze. "What about your other child, Mr. Ferguson?" asked Holmes. "Might we make the acquaintance of the baby?" "Ask Mrs. Mason to bring baby down," said Ferguson. The boy went off with a curious, shambling gait which told my surgical eyes that he was suffering from a weak spine. Presently he returned, and behind him came a tall, gaunt woman bearing in her arms a very beautiful child, dark-eyed, golden-haired, a wonderful mixture of the Saxon and the Latin. Ferguson was evidently devoted to it, for he took it into his arms and fondled it most tenderly. "Fancy anyone having the heart to hurt him," he muttered, as he glanced down at the small, angry red pucker upon the cherub throat. It was at this moment that I chanced to glance at Holmes, and saw a most singular intentness in his expression. His face was as set as if it had been carved out of old ivory, and his eyes, which had glanced for a moment at father and child, were now fixed with eager curiosity upon something at the other side of the room. Following his gaze, I could only guess that he was looking out through the window at the melancholy, dripping garden. It is true that a shutter had half closed outside and obstructed the view, but none the less it was certainly at the window that Holmes was fixing his concentrated attention. Then he smiled, and his eyes came back to the baby. On its chubby neck there was this small, puckered mark. Without speaking, Holmes examined it with care. Finally, he shook one of the dimpled fists, which waved in front of him. "Goodbye, little man. You have made a strange start in life. Nurse, I should wish to have a word with you in private." He took her aside and spoke earnestly for a few minutes. I only heard the last words, which were, "Your anxiety will soon, I hope, be set at rest." The woman, who seemed to be a sour, silent kind of creature, withdrew with the child. "What is Mrs. Mason like?" asked Holmes. "Not very prepossessing externally, as you can see, but a heart of gold and devoted to the child. Do you like her, Jack?" Holmes turned suddenly upon the boy. His expressive mobile face shadowed over, and he shook his head. "Jackie has very strong likes and dislikes," said Ferguson, putting his arm round the boy. "Luckily, I am one of his likes." The boy cooed and nestled his head upon his father's breast. Ferguson gently disengaged him. "Run away, little Jackie," said he, and he watched his son with loving eyes until he disappeared. "Now, Mr. Holmes," he continued, when the boy was gone, "I really feel that I have brought you on a fool's errand, for what can you possibly do save give me your sympathy? It must be an exceedingly delicate and complex affair from your point of view." "It is certainly delicate," said my friend with an amused smile, "but I have not been struck up to now with its complexity. It has been a case for intellectual deduction, but when this original intellectual deduction is confirmed point by quite a number of independent incidents, then the subjective becomes objective, and we can say confidently that we have reached our goal. I had, in fact, reached it before we left Baker Street, and the rest has merely been observation and confirmation." Ferguson put his big hand to his furrowed forehead. "For heaven's sake, Holmes," he said hoarsely, "if you can see the truth in this matter, do not keep me in suspense." "How do I stand? What shall I do? I care nothing as to how you have found your facts, so long as you have really got them." "Certainly I owe you an explanation, and you shall have it. But you will permit me to handle the matter in my own way. Is the lady capable of seeing us, Watson?" "She is ill, but she is quite rational." "Very good. It is only in her presence that we can clear the matter up. Let us go up to her." "She will not see me," cried Ferguson. "Oh, yes, she will," said Holmes. He scribbled a few lines upon a sheet of paper. "You at least have the entree, Watson. Will you have the goodness to give the lady this note?" I ascended again and handed the note to Dolores, who cautiously opened the door. A minute later, I heard a cry from within, a cry in which joy and surprise seemed to be blended. Dolores looked out. "She will see them. She will listen," said she. At my summons, Ferguson and Holmes came up. As we entered the room, Ferguson took a step or two towards his wife, who had raised herself in the bed, but she held out her hand to repulse him. He sank into an armchair while Holmes seated himself beside him, after bowing to the lady, who looked at him with wide-eyed amazement. "I think we can dispense with Dolores," said Holmes. "Oh, very well, madame. If you would rather she stayed, I can see no objection. Now, Mr. Ferguson, I am a busy man with many calls, and my methods have to be short and direct. The swiftest surgery is the least painful. Let me first say what will ease your mind. Your wife is a very good, a very loving, and a very ill-used woman." Ferguson sat up with a cry of joy. "Prove that, Mr. Holmes, and I am your debtor forever." "I will do so, but in doing so I must wound you deeply in another direction. I care nothing so long as you clear my wife. Everything on earth is insignificant compared to that. Let me tell you, then, the train of reasoning which passed through my mind in Baker Street. The idea of a vampire was to me absurd. Such things do not happen in criminal practice in England. And yet your observation was precise. You had seen the lady rise from beside the child's cot with the blood upon her lips. I did. Did it not occur to you that a bleeding wound may be sucked for some other purpose than to draw the blood from it? Was there not a queen in English history who sucked such a wound to draw poison from it? Poison. Chapter 6. The Adventure of the Three Garadebs. It may have been a comedy, or it may have been a tragedy. It cost one man his reason, it cost me a bloodletting, and it cost yet another man the penalties of the law. Yet there was certainly an element of comedy. Well, you shall judge for yourselves. I remember the date very well, for it was in the same month that Holmes refused a knighthood for services which may perhaps some day be described. I only refer to the matter in passing, for in my position of partner and confidant I am obliged to be particularly careful to avoid any indiscretion. I repeat, however, that this enables me to fix the date, which was the latter end of June 1902, shortly after the conclusion of the South African War. Holmes had spent several days in bed, as was his habit from time to time, but he emerged that morning with a long foolscap document in his hand and a twinkle of amusement in his austere grey eyes. "There is a chance for you to make some money, friend Watson," said he. "Have you ever heard the name of Garadeb?" I admitted that I had not. "Well, if you can lay your hand upon a Garadeb, there's money in it." "Why?" "Ah, that's a long story, rather a whimsical one too. I don't think in all our explorations of human complexities we have ever come upon anything more singular. The fellow will be here presently for cross-examination, so I won't open the matter up till he comes. But meanwhile, that's the name we want." The telephone directory lay on the table beside me, and I turned over the pages in a rather hopeless quest. But to my amazement, there was this strange name in its due place. I gave a cry of triumph. "Here you are, Holmes. Here it is." Holmes took the book from my hand. "Garadeb N," he read, 136 Little Rider Street, WWE. "Sorry to disappoint you, my dear Watson, but this is the man himself. That is the address upon his letter. We want another to match him." Mrs. Hudson had come in with a card upon a tray. I took it up and glanced at it. "Why, here it is!" I cried in amazement. "This is a different initial, John Garadeb, Counselor at Law, Moorville, Kansas, USA. Holmes smiled as he looked at the card. "I'm afraid you must make yet another effort, Watson," said he. "This gentleman is also in the plot already, though I certainly did not expect to see him this morning. However, he is in a position to tell us a good deal which I want to know." A moment later, he was in the room. Mr. John Garadeb, Counselor at Law, was a short, powerful man with the round, fresh, clean-shaven face characteristic of so many American men of affairs. The general effect was chubby and rather childlike, so that one received the impression of quite a young man with a broad-set smile upon his face. His eyes, however, were arresting. Seldom in any human head have I seen a pair which bespoke a more intense inward life. So bright were they, so alert, so responsive to every change of thought. His accent was American, but was not accompanied by any eccentricity of speech. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, glancing from one to the other. "Ah, yes. Your pictures are not unlike you, sir, if I may say so. I believe you have had a letter from my namesake, Mr. Nathan Garadeb, have you not?" "Pray sit down," said Sherlock Holmes. "We shall, I fancy, have a good deal to discuss." He took up his sheets of foolscap. "You are, of course, the Mr. John Garadeb mentioned in this document, but surely you have been in England some time." "Why do you say that, Mr. Holmes?" I seem to read sudden suspicion in those expressive eyes. "Your whole outfit is English." Mr. Garadeb forced a laugh. I've read of your tricks, Mr. Holmes, but I never thought I would be the subject of them. Where do you read that? The shoulder cut of your coat, the toes of your boots. Could anyone doubt it? Well, I had no idea I was so obvious a Britisher, but business brought me over here some time ago, and so, as you say, my outfit is nearly all London. However, I guess your time is of value, and we did not meet to talk about the cut of my socks. What about getting down to that paper you hold in your hand? Holmes had in some way ruffled our visitor, whose chubby face had assumed a far less amiable expression. "Patience! Patience, Mr. Garrideb," said my friend in a soothing voice. "Dr. Watson would tell you that these little digressions of mine sometimes prove in the end to have some bearing on the matter." "But why did Mr. Nathan Garrideb not come with you?" "Why did he ever drag you into it at all?" asked our visitor with a sudden outflame of anger. "What in thunder had you to do with it? Here was a bit of professional business between two gentlemen, and one of them must needs call in a detective. I saw him this morning, and he told me this fool trick he had played me, and that's why I am here. But I feel bad about it, all the same." "There was no reflection upon you, Mr. Garrideb. It was simply zeal upon his part to gain your end, an end which is, I understand, equally vital for both of you. He knew that I had means of getting information, and therefore it was very natural that he should apply to me." Our visitor's angry face gradually cleared. "Well, that puts it different," said he. "When I went to see him this morning and he told me he had sent to a detective, I just asked for your address and came right away. I don't want police butting into a private matter, but if you are content just to help us find the man, there can be no harm in that." "Well, that is just how it stands," said Holmes. "And now, sir, since you are here, we had best have a clear account from your own lips. My friend here knows nothing of the details." Mr. Garrideb surveyed me with not too friendly a gaze. "Need he know?" he asked. "We usually work together." "Well, there's no reason it should be kept a secret. I'll give you the facts as short as I can make them. If you came from Kansas, I would not need to explain to you who Alexander Hamilton Garrideb was. He made his money in real estate and afterwards in the wheat pit at Chicago, but he spent it in buying up as much land as would make one of your counties, lying along the Arkansas River west of Fort Dodge. It's grazing land and lumberland and arable land and mineralized land and just every sort of land that brings dollars to the man that owns it. He had no kith nor kin, or if he had, I never heard of it, but he took a kind of pride in the queerness of his name. That was what brought us together. I was in the law at Topeka, and one day I had a visit from the old man, and he was tickled to death to meet another man with his own name. It was his pet fad, and he was dead set to find out if there were any more Garridebs in the world. "Find me another," said he. I told him I was a busy man and could not spend my life hiking round the world in search of Garridebs. "Nonetheless," said he, "that is just what you will do if things pan out as I planned them." I thought he was joking, but there was a powerful lot of meaning in the words, as I was soon to discover. For he died within a year of saying them, and he left a will behind him. It was the queerest will that has ever been filed in the state of Kansas. His property was divided into 3 parts, and I was to have one on condition that I found 2 Garridebs who would share the remainder. It's $5 million for each if it is a cent, but we can't lay a finger on it until we all 3 stand in a row. It was so big a chance that I just let my legal practice slide, and I set forth looking for Garridebs. There is not one in the United States. I went through it, sir, with a fine-toothed comb, and never a Garrideb could I catch. Then I tried the old country. Sure enough, there was the name in the London telephone directory. I went after him 2 days ago and explained the whole matter to him. But he is a lone man, like myself, with some women relations, but no men. It says 3 adult men in the will. So you see we still have a vacancy, and if you can help to fill it, we will be very ready to pay your charges. "Well, Watson," said Holmes with a smile, "I said it was rather whimsical, did I not?" "I should have thought, sir, that your obvious way was to advertise in the agony columns of the papers." "I have done that, Mr. Holmes." No replies. "Dear me. Well, it is certainly a most curious little problem. I may take a glance at it in my leisure. By the way, it is curious that you should have come from Topeka. I used to have a correspondent. He is dead now. Old Dr. Lysander Starr, who was mayor in 1890. "Good old Dr. Starr," said our visitor. "His name is still honored. Well, Mr. Holmes, I suppose all we can do is to report to you and let you know how we progress. I reckon you will hear within a day or two." With this assurance, our American bowed and departed. Holmes had lit his pipe, and he sat for some time with a curious smile upon his face. "Well?" I asked at last. "I'm wondering, Watson, just wondering." "At what?" Holmes took his pipe from his lips. "I was wondering, Watson, what on earth could be the object of this man in telling us such a rigmarole of lies? I nearly asked him so, for there are times when a brutal frontal attack is the best policy, but I judged it better to let him think he had fooled us. Here is a man with an English coat frayed at the elbow and trousers bagged at the knee with a year's wear, and yet by this document and by his own account, he is a provincial American lately landed in London. There have been no advertisements in the agony columns. You know that I miss nothing there. They are my favorite covert for putting up a bird, and I would never have overlooked such a cock-pheasant as that. I never knew a Dr. Lysander Starr of Topeka. Touch him where you would he was false. I think the fellow is really an American, but he has worn his accent smooth with years of London. What is his game, then, and what motive lies behind this preposterous search for Garridebs? It's worth our attention, for, granting that the man is a rascal, he is certainly a complex and ingenious one. We must now find out if our other correspondent is a fraud also. Just ring him up, Watson." I did so, and heard a thin, quavering voice at the other end of the line. "Yes, yes, I am Mr. Nathan Garrideb. Is Mr. Holmes there? I should very much like to have a word with Mr. Holmes." My friend took the instrument, and I heard the usual syncopated dialogue. "Yes, he has been here. I understand that you don't know him." "How long?" "Only 2 days." "Yes, yes, of course, it is a most captivating prospect. Will you be at home this evening? I suppose your namesake will not be there." "Very good. We will come then, for I would rather have a chat without him. Dr. Watson will come with me. I understood from your note that you did not go out often." "Well, we shall be round about 6. "You need not mention it to the American lawyer." "Very good. Goodbye." It was twilight of a lovely spring evening, and even Little Ryder Street, one of the smaller offshoots from the Edgware Road, within a stone cast of old Tyburn tree of evil memory, looked golden and wonderful in the slanting rays of the setting sun. The particular house to which we were directed was a large, old-fashioned, early Georgian edifice with a flat brick face broken only by 2 deep bay windows on the ground floor. It was on this ground floor that our client lived, and indeed the low windows proved to be the front of the huge room in which he spent his waking hours. Holmes pointed as we passed to the small brass plate which bore the curious name. "Up some years, Watson," he remarked, indicating its discoloured surface. "It's his real name anyhow, and that is something to note." The house had a common stair, and there were a number of names painted in the hall, some indicating offices and some private chambers. It was not a collection of residential flats, but rather the abode of bohemian bachelors. Our client opened the door for us himself, and apologized by saying that the woman in charge left at 4 o'clock. Mr. Nathan Garrideb proved to be a very tall, loose-jointed, round-backed person, gaunt and bald, some 60-odd years of age. He had a cadaverous face, with the dull, dead skin of a man to whom exercise was unknown. Large, round spectacles and a small projecting goat's beard combined with his stooping attitude to give him an expression of peering curiosity. The general effect, however, was amiable, though eccentric. The room was as curious as its occupant. It looked like a small museum. It was both broad and deep, with cupboards and cabinets all round, crowded with specimens, geological and anatomical. Cases of butterflies and moths flanked each side of the entrance. A large table in the center was littered with all sorts of debris, while the tall brass tube of a powerful microscope bristled up amongst them. As I glanced round, I was surprised at the universality of the man's interests. Here was a case of ancient coins. There was a cabinet of flint instruments. Behind his central table was a large cupboard of fossil bones. Above was a line of plaster skulls with such names as Neanderthal, Heidelberg, Cro-Magnon printed beneath them. It was clear that he was a student of many subjects. As he stood in front of us now, he held a piece of chamois leather in his right hand with which he was polishing a coin. Syracusan, of the best period, he explained, holding it up. They degenerated greatly towards the end. At their best, I hold them supreme, though some prefer the Alexandrian school. You will find a chair here, Mr. Holmes. Pray allow me to clear these bones. And you, sir? Ah, yes, Dr. Watson, if you would have the goodness to put the Japanese vase to one side. You see round me my little interests in life. My doctor lectures me about never going out. But why should I go out when I have so much to hold me here? I can assure you that the adequate cataloguing of one of those cabinets would take me 3 good months. Holmes looked round him with curiosity. But do you tell me that you never go out? He said. Now and again I drive down to Sotheby's or Christie's. Otherwise I very seldom leave my room. I'm not too strong, and my researches are very absorbing. But you can imagine, Mr. Holmes, what a terrific shock, pleasant but terrific, it was for me when I heard of this unparalleled good fortune. It only needs one more Gary Deb to complete the matter, and surely we can find one. I had a brother, but he is dead, and female relatives are disqualified. But there must surely be others in the world. I had heard that you handled strange cases, and that was why I sent to you. Of course, this American gentleman is quite right, and I should have taken his advice first. But I acted for the best. I think you acted very wisely indeed, said Holmes. But are you really anxious to acquire an estate in America? Certainly not, sir. Nothing would induce me to leave my collection, but this gentleman has assured me that he will buy me out as soon as we have established our claim. $5 million was the sum named. There are a dozen specimens in the market at the present moment which fill gaps in my collection and which I am unable to purchase for want of a few £100. Just think what I could do with $5 million. Why, I have the nucleus of a national collection. I shall be the Hans Sloane of my age. His eyes gleamed behind his great spectacles. It was very clear that no pains would be spared by Mr. Nathan Garrideb in finding a namesake. I merely called to make your acquaintance, and there is no reason why I should interrupt your studies, said Holmes. I prefer to establish personal touch with those with whom I do business. There are few questions I need ask, for I have your very clear narrative in my pocket, and I filled up the blanks when this American gentleman called. I understand that up to this week you were unaware of his existence. That is so. He called last Tuesday. Did he tell you of our interview today? Yes, he came straight back to me. He had been very angry. Why should he be angry? He seemed to think it was some reflection on his honor, but he was quite cheerful again when he returned. Did he suggest any course of action? No, sir, he did not. Has he had or asked for any money from you? No, sir, Never. You see no possible object he has in view? None, except what he states. Did you tell him of our telephone appointment? Yes, sir, I did. Holmes was lost in thought. I could see that he was puzzled. And have you any articles of great value in your collection? No, sir. I'm not a rich man. It's a good collection, but not a very valuable one. You have no fear of burglars? Not the least. How long have you been in these rooms? Nearly 5 years. Holmes's cross-examination was interrupted by an imperative knocking at the door. No sooner had our client unlatched it than the American lawyer burst excitedly into the room. "Here you are," he cried, waving a paper over his head. "I thought I should be in time to get you. Mr. Nathan Garrideb, my congratulations. You are a rich man, sir. Our business is happily finished, and all is well. As to you, Mr. Holmes, we can only say we are sorry if we have given you any useless trouble." He handed over the paper to our client, who stood staring at a marked advertisement. Holmes and I leaned forward and read it over his shoulder. This is how it ran. Plus vertical bar, vertical bar, vertical bar, Howard Garrideb. Vertical bar, vertical bar, vertical bar, vertical bar, constructor of agricultural machinery. Vertical bar, vertical bar, vertical bar, vertical bar, binders, reapers' steam and hand plows, drills, vertical bar, harrows, farmers' carts, buckboards, and all other vertical bar appliances. Vertical bar, vertical bar, vertical bar, vertical bar estimates for artesian wells. Vertical bar, vertical bar, vertical bar, vertical bar, apply Grosvenor Buildings, Aston. Vertical bar, vertical bar, vertical bar, plus... Namu. Plus. Glorious, gasped our host. That makes our third man. I had opened up inquiries in Birmingham, said the American, and my agent there has sent me this advertisement from a local paper. We must hustle and put the thing through. I have written to this man and told him that you will see him in his office tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock. You want me to see him? What do you say, Mr. Holmes? Don't you think it would be wiser? Here am I, a wandering American with a wonderful tale. Why should he believe what I tell him? But you are a Britisher with solid references, and he is bound to take notice of what you say. I would go with you if you wished, but I have a very busy day tomorrow, and I could always follow you if you are in any trouble. Well, I have not made such a journey for years. It is nothing, Mr. Garrideb. I have figured out your connections. You leave at 12 and should be there soon after 2. Then you can be back the same night. All you have to do is to see this man, explain the matter, and get an affidavit of his existence. By the Lord, he added hotly, considering I've come all the way from the center of America, it is surely little enough if you go 100 miles in order to put this matter through. Quite so, said Holmes. I think what this gentleman says is very true. Mr. Nathan Garrideb shrugged his shoulders with a disconsolate air. Well, if you insist I shall go, said he. It is certainly hard for me to refuse you anything, considering the glory of hope that you have brought into my life. Then that is agreed, said Holmes, and no doubt you will let me have a report as soon as you can. I'll see to that, said the American. Well, he added, looking at his watch, I'll have to get on. I'll call tomorrow, Mr. Nathan, and see you off to Birmingham. Coming my way, Mr. Holmes? Well then, goodbye, and we may have good news for you tomorrow night. I noticed that my friend's face cleared when the American left the room, and the look of thoughtful perplexity had vanished. I wish I could look over your collection, Mr. Garrideb, said he. In my profession, all sorts of odd knowledge comes useful, and this room of yours is a storehouse of it. Our client shone with pleasure, and his eyes gleamed from behind his big glasses. "I had always heard, sir, that you were a very intelligent man," said he. "I could take you round now, if you have the time." "Unfortunately, I have not, but these specimens are so well labelled and classified that they hardly need your personal explanation. If I should be able to look in tomorrow, I presume that there would be no objection to my glancing over them." "None at all. You are most welcome. The place will, of course, be shut up, but Mrs. Saunders is in the basement up to 4 o'clock and would let you in with her key." "Well, I happen to be clear tomorrow afternoon. If you would say a word to Mrs. Saunders, it would be quite in order. By the way, who is your house agent?" Our client was amazed at the sudden question. "Holloway and Steele in the Edgware Road." "But why?" "I'm a bit of an archaeologist myself when it comes to houses," said Holmes, laughing. "I was wondering if this was Queen Anne or Georgian." "Georgian, beyond doubt." "Really? I should have thought a little earlier. However, it is easily ascertained. Well, goodbye, Mr. Garrideb, and may you have every success in your Birmingham journey." The house agent's was close by, but we found that it was closed for the day, so we made our way back to Baker Street. It was not till after dinner that Holmes reverted to the subject. "Our little problem draws to a close," said he. "No doubt you have outlined the solution in your own mind. I can make neither head nor tail of it. The head is surely clear enough, and the tail we should see tomorrow. Did you notice nothing curious about that advertisement?" "I saw that the word plough was misspelt." "Oh, you did notice that, did you? Come, Watson, you improve all the time. Yes, it was bad English, but good American. The printer had set it up as received. Then the buckboards? That is American also, and artesian wells are commoner with them than with us. It was a typical American advertisement, but purporting to be from an English firm. What do you make of that?" "I can only suppose that this American lawyer put it in himself. What his object was, I fail to understand." "Well, there are alternative explanations. Anyhow, he wanted to get this good old fossil up to Birmingham. That is very clear. I might have told him that he was clearly going on a wild goose chase, but on second thoughts it seemed better to clear the stage by letting him go. Tomorrow, Watson, well, tomorrow will speak for itself." Holmes was up and out early. When he returned at lunchtime, I noticed that his face was very grave. "This is a more serious matter than I had expected, Watson," said he. "It is fair to tell you so, though I know it will only be an additional reason to you for running your head into danger. I should know my Watson by now. But there is danger, and you should know it." "Well, it is not the first we have shared, Holmes. I hope it may not be the last." "What is the particular danger this time?" "We are up against a very hard case. I have identified Mr. John Garrideb, Counsellor at Law. He is none other than Killer Evans, of sinister and murderous reputation." "I fear I am none the wiser." "Ah, it is not part of your profession to carry about a portable Newgate calendar in your memory. I have been down to see friend Lestrade at the Yard. There may be an occasional want of imaginative intuition down there, but they lead the world for thoroughness and method. I had an idea that we might get on the track of our American friend in their records." Sure enough, I found his chubby face smiling up at me from the Rogues' Portrait Gallery. "James Winter, alias Moorcroft, alias Killer Evans," was the inscription below. Holmes drew an envelope from his pocket. I scribbled down a few points from his dossier. Age 44, native of Chicago, known to have shot 3 men in the States, escaped from penitentiary through political influence. Came to London in 1893, shot a man over cards in a nightclub in the Waterloo Road in January 1895. Man died, but he was shown to have been the aggressor in the row. Dead man was identified as Roger Prescott, famous as forger and coiner in Chicago. Killer Evans, released in 1901. Has been under police supervision since, but so far as known has led an honest life. Very dangerous man, usually carries arms and is prepared to use them. That is our bird, Watson, a sporting bird, as you must admit. But what is his game? Well, it begins to define itself. I have been to the house agents. Our client, as he told us, has been there 5 years. It was unlet for a year before then. The previous tenant was a gentleman at large named Waldron. Waldron's appearance was well remembered at the office. He had suddenly vanished, and nothing more been heard of him. He was a tall, bearded man with very dark features. Now, Prescott, the man whom Killer Evans had shot, was, according to Scotland Yard, a tall, dark man with a beard. As a working hypothesis, I think we may take it that Prescott, the American criminal, used to live in the very room which our innocent friend now devotes to his museum. So at last we get a link, you see. And the next link? Well, we must go now and look for that. He took a revolver from the drawer and handed it to me. I have my old favorite with me. If our Wild West friend tries to live up to his nickname, we must be ready for him. I'll give you an hour for a siesta, Watson, and then I think it will be time for our Ryder Street adventure. It was just 4 o'clock when we reached the curious apartment of Nathan Garrideb. Mrs. Saunders, the caretaker, was about to leave, but she had no hesitation in admitting us, for the door shut with a spring lock, and Holmes promised to see that all was safe before we left. Shortly afterwards, the outer door closed, her bonnet passed the bow window, and we knew that we were alone in the lower floor of the house. Holmes made a rapid examination of the premises. There was one cupboard in a dark corner, which stood out a little from the wall. It was behind this that we eventually crouched, while Holmes, in a whisper, outlined his intentions. He wanted to get our amiable friend out of his room, that is very clear, and, as the collector never went out, it took some planning to do it. The whole of this Garrideb invention was apparently for no other end. I must say, Watson, that there is a certain devilish ingenuity about it, even if the queer name of the tenant did give him an opening which he could hardly have expected. He wove his plot with remarkable cunning. But what did he want? Well, that is what we're here to find out. It has nothing whatever to do with our client, so far as I can read the situation. It is something connected with the man he murdered, the man who may have been his confederate in crime. There is some guilty secret in the room. That is how I read it. At first I thought our friend might have something in his collection more valuable than he knew, something worth the attention of a big criminal. But the fact that Roger Prescott of evil memory inhabited these rooms points to some deeper reason. Well, Watson, we can but possess our souls in patience and see what the hour may bring. That hour was not long in striking. We crouched closer in the shadow as we heard the outer door open and shut. Then came the sharp, metallic snap of a key, and the American was in the room. He closed the door softly behind him, took a sharp glance around him to see that all was safe, threw off his overcoat, and walked up to the central table with the brisk manner of one who knows exactly what he has to do and how to do it. He pushed the table to one side, tore up the square of carpet on which it rested, rolled it completely back, and then, drawing a jemmy from his inside pocket, he knelt down and worked vigorously upon the floor. Presently we heard the sound of sliding boards, and an instant later a square had opened in the planks. Killer Evans struck a match, lit a stump of candle, and vanished from our view. Clearly our moment had come. Holmes touched my wrist as a signal, and together we stole across to the open trapdoor. Gently as we moved, however, the old floor must have creaked under our feet, for the head of our American, peering anxiously round, emerged suddenly from the open space. His face turned upon us with a glare of baffled rage, which gradually softened into a rather shamefaced grin as he realized that 2 pistols were pointed at his head. "Well, well," said he coolly as he scrambled to the surface. "I guess you have been one too many for me, Mr. Holmes. Saw through my game, I suppose, and played me for a sucker from the first. Well, sir, I hand it to you. You have me beaten." In an instant, he had whisked out a revolver from his breast and had fired 2 shots. I felt a sudden hot sear, as if a red-hot iron had been pressed to my thigh. There was a crash as Holmes's pistol came down on the man's head. I had a vision of him sprawling upon the floor with blood running down his face while Holmes rummaged him for weapons. Then my friend's wiry arms were round me, and he was leading me to a chair. "You're not hurt, Watson? For God's sake, say that you are not hurt." It was worth a wound. It was worth many wounds to know the depth of loyalty and love which lay behind that cold mask. The clear, hard eyes were dimmed for a moment, and the firm lips were shaking. For the one and only time I caught a glimpse of a great heart as well as of a great brain. All my years of humble but single-minded service culminated in that moment of revelation. "It's nothing, Holmes. It's a mere scratch." He had ripped up my trousers with his pocket-knife. "You are right," he cried, with an immense sigh of relief. "It is quite superficial." His face set like flint as he glared at our prisoner, who was sitting up with a dazed face. "By the Lord, it is as well for you. If you had killed Watson, you would not have got out of this room alive. Now, sir, what have you to say for yourself?" He had nothing to say for himself. He only lay and scowled. I leaned on Holmes's arm, and together we looked down into the small cellar which had been disclosed by the secret flap. It was still illuminated by the candle which Evans had taken down with him. Our eyes fell upon a mass of rusted machinery, great rolls of paper, a litter of bottles, and, neatly arranged upon a small table, a number of neat little bundles. "A printing press, a counterfeiter's outfit," said Holmes. "Yes, sir," said our prisoner, staggering slowly to his feet and then sinking into the chair. "The greatest counterfeiter London ever saw. That's Prescott's machine, and those bundles on the table are 2,000 of Prescott's notes worth 100 each and fit to pass anywhere. Help yourselves, gentlemen, call it a deal, and let me beat it." Holmes laughed. "We don't do things like that, Mr. Evans. There is no bolt hole for you in this country. You shot this man Prescott, did you not?" "Yes, sir, and got 5 years for it, though it was he who pulled on me. 5 years, when I should have had a medal the size of a soup plate. No living man could tell a Prescott from a Bank of England, and if I hadn't put him out, he would have flooded London with them. I was the only one in the world who knew where he made them. Can you wonder that I wanted to get to the place? And can you wonder that when I found this crazy boob of a bug hunter with the queer name squatting right on the top of it and never quitting his room, I had to do the best I could to shift him? Maybe I would have been wiser if I had put him away. It would have been easy enough, but I'm a soft-hearted guy that can't begin shooting unless the other man has a gun also. But say, Mr. Holmes, what have I done wrong anyhow? I've not used this plant. I've not hurt this old stiff. Where do you get me?" "Only attempted murder, so far as I can see," said Holmes. "But that's not our job. They take that at the next stage. What we wanted at present was just your sweet self. Please give the Yard a call, Watson. It won't be entirely unexpected." So those were the facts about Killer Evans and his remarkable invention of the 3 Gary Debs. We heard later that our poor old friend never got over the shock of his dissipated dreams. When his castle in the air fell down, it buried him beneath the ruins. He was last heard of at a nursing home in Brixton. It was a glad day at the Yard when the Prescott outfit was discovered, for though they knew that it existed, they had never been able, after the death of the man, to find out where it was. Evans had indeed done great service and caused several worthy CID men to sleep the sounder, for the counterfeiter stands in a class by himself as a public danger. They would willingly have subscribed to that soup plate medal of which the criminal had spoken, but an unappreciative bench took a less favorable view, and the killer returned to those shades from which he had just emerged. Chapter 7. The problem of Thor Bridge. Somewhere in the vaults of the Bank of Cox and Company, at Charing Cross, there is a travel-worn and battered tin dispatch box with my name, John H. Watson, Maryland, late Indian Army, painted upon the lid. It is crammed with papers, nearly all of which are records of cases to illustrate the curious problems which Mr. Sherlock Holmes had at various times to examine. Some, and not the least interesting, were complete failures, and as such will hardly bear narrating, since no final explanation is forthcoming. A problem without a solution may interest the student, but can hardly fail to annoy the casual reader. Among these unfinished tales is that of Mr. James Phillimore, who, stepping back into his own house to get his umbrella, was never more seen in this world. No less remarkable is that of the cutter Alicia, which sailed one spring morning into a small patch of mist from where she never again emerged, nor was anything further ever heard of herself and her crew. A third case worthy of note is that of Isidora Pisano, the well-known journalist and duelist, who was found stark, staring mad with a matchbox in front of him which contained a remarkable worm, said to be unknown to science. Apart from these unfathomed cases, there are some which involve the secrets of private families to an extent which would mean consternation in many exalted quarters if it were thought possible that they might find their way into print. I need not say that such a breach of confidence is unthinkable, and that these records will be separated and destroyed now that my friend has time to turn his energies to the matter. There remain a considerable residue of cases of greater or less interest which I might have edited, before had I not feared to give the public a surfeit which might react upon the reputation of the man whom, above all others, I revere. In some, I was myself concerned and can speak as an eyewitness, while in others I was either not present or played so small a part that they could only be told as by a third person. The following narrative is drawn from my own experience. It was a wild morning in October, and I observed as I was dressing how the last remaining leaves were being whirled from the solitary plane tree which graces the yard behind our house. I descended to breakfast, prepared to find my companion in depressed spirits, for, like all great artists, he was easily impressed by his surroundings. On the contrary, I found that he had nearly finished his meal, and that his mood was particularly bright and joyous, with that somewhat sinister cheerfulness which was characteristic of his lighter moments. "You have a case, Holmes," I remarked. "The faculty of deduction is certainly contagious, Watson," he answered. "It has enabled you to probe my secret. Yes, I have a case. After a month of trivialities and stagnation, the wheels move once more." "Might I share it?" "There is little to share, but we may discuss it when you have consumed the 2 hard-boiled eggs with which our new cook has favored us. Their condition may not be unconnected with the copy of the Family Herald, which I observed yesterday upon the hall table. Even so, trivial a matter as cooking an egg demands an attention which is conscious of the passage of time and incompatible with the love romance in that excellent periodical." A quarter of an hour later the table had been cleared, and we were face to face. He had drawn a letter from his pocket. "You have heard of Neil Gibson, the Gold King?" he said. "You mean the American senator?" "Well, he was once senator for some western state, but is better known as the greatest gold-mining magnate in the world." "Yes, I know of him. He has surely lived in England for some time. His name is very familiar." "Yes, he bought a considerable estate in Hampshire some 5 years ago. Possibly you have already heard of the tragic end of his wife?" "Of course, I remember it now. That is why the name is familiar. But I really know nothing of the details." Holmes waved his hand towards some papers on a chair. "I had no idea that the case was coming my way, or I should have had my extracts ready," said he. "The fact is that the problem, though exceedingly sensational, appeared to present no difficulty. The interesting personality of the accused does not obscure the clearness of the evidence, That was the view taken by the coroner's jury and also in the police court proceedings. It is now referred to the assizes at Winchester. I fear it is a thankless business. I can discover facts, Watson, but I cannot change them. Unless some entirely new and unexpected ones come to light, I do not see what my client can hope for. Your client? Ah, I forgot I had not told you. I am getting into your involved habit, Watson, of telling a story backwards. You had best read this first. The letter which he handed to me, written in a bold, masterful hand, ran as follows. Claridge's Hotel, October 3rd. Dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I can't see the best woman God ever made go to her death without doing all that is possible to save her. I can't explain things. I can't even try to explain them, but I know beyond all doubt that Miss Dunbar is innocent. You know the facts. Who doesn't? It has been the gossip of the country, and never a voice raised for her. It's the damned injustice of it all that makes me crazy. That woman has a heart that wouldn't let her kill a fly. Well, I'll come at 11 tomorrow and see if you can get some ray of light in the dark. Maybe I have a clue and don't know it. Anyhow, all I know and all I have and all I am are for your use if only you can save her. If ever in your life you showed your powers, put them now into this case. Yours faithfully, J. Neil Gibson. There you have it, said Sherlock Holmes, knocking out the ashes of his after-breakfast pipe and slowly refilling it. That is the gentleman I await. As to the story, you have hardly time to master all these papers, so I must give it to you in a nutshell if you are to take an intelligent interest in the proceedings. This man is the greatest financial power in the world, and a man, as I understand, of most violent and formidable character. He married a wife, the victim of this tragedy, of whom I know nothing save that she was past her prime, which was the more unfortunate as a very attractive governess superintended the education of 2 young children. These are the 3 people concerned, and the scene is a grand old manor house, the centre of an historical English estate. Then, as to the tragedy, the wife was found in the grounds nearly half a mile from the house, late at night, clad in her dinner dress, with a shawl over her shoulders and a revolver bullet through her brain. No weapon was found near her, and there was no local clue as to the murder. No weapon near her, Watson. Mark that. The crime seems to have been committed late in the evening, and the body was found by a gamekeeper about 11 o'clock, when it was examined by the police and by a doctor before being carried up to the house. Is this too condensed, or can you follow it clearly? It is all very clear. But why suspect the governess? Well, in the first place, there is some very direct evidence. A revolver with 1 discharged chamber and a caliber which corresponded with the bullet was found on the floor of her wardrobe. His eyes fixed, and he repeated in broken words, "On the floor of her wardrobe." Then he sank into silence, and I saw that some train of thought had been set moving which I should be foolish to interrupt. Suddenly, with a start, he emerged into brisk life once more. "Yes, Watson, it was found. Pretty damning, eh?" So the 2 juries thought. Then the dead woman had a note upon her making an appointment at that very place and signed by the governess. How's that? Finally, there is the motive. Senator Gibson is an attractive person. If his wife dies, who more likely to succeed her than the young lady who had already, by all accounts, received pressing attentions from her employer? Love, fortune, power, all depending upon one middle-aged life. Ugly, Watson. Very ugly. Yes, indeed, Holmes. Nor could she prove an alibi. On the contrary, she had to admit that she was down near Thor Bridge. That was the scene of the tragedy about that hour. She couldn't deny it, for some passing villager had seen her there. That really seems final. And yet, Watson, and yet, this bridge, a single broad span of stone with balustraded sides, carries the drive over the narrowest part of a long, deep, reed-girt sheet of water. Thor Mere it is called. In the mouth of the bridge lay the dead woman. Such are the main facts. But here, if I mistake not, is our client, considerably before his time." Billy had opened the door, but the name which he announced was an unexpected one. Mr. Marlowe Bates was a stranger to both of us. He was a thin, nervous wisp of a man with frightened eyes and a twitching, hesitating manner, a man whom my own professional eye would judge to be on the brink of an absolute nervous breakdown. "You seem agitated, Mr. Bates," said Holmes. "Pray sit down. I fear I can only give you a short time, for I have an appointment at 11. "I know you have," our visitor gasped, shooting out short sentences like a man who is out of breath. "Mr. Gibson is coming. Mr. Gibson is my employer. I am manager of his estate. Mr. Holmes, he is a villain, an infernal villain." "Strong language, Mr. Bates. I have to be emphatic, Mr. Holmes, for the time is so limited. I would not have him find me here for the world. He is almost due now, but I was so situated that I could not come earlier. His secretary, Mr. Ferguson, only told me this morning of his appointment with you." "And you are his manager?" "I have given him notice. In a couple of weeks I shall have shaken off his accursed slavery. A hard man, Mr. Holmes, hard to all about him. Those public charities are a screen to cover his private iniquities. But his wife was his chief victim. He was brutal to her. Yes, sir, brutal. How she came by her death I do not know, but I am sure that he had made her life a misery to her. She was a creature of the tropics, a Brazilian by birth, as no doubt you know." "No, it had escaped me. Tropical by birth and tropical by nature. A child of the sun and of passion. She had loved him as such women can love, but when her own physical charms had faded, I am told that they once were great. There was nothing to hold him. We all liked her and felt for her and hated him for the way that he treated her. But he is plausible and cunning. That is all I have to say to you. Don't take him at his face value. There is more behind. Now I'll go." No, don't detain me. He is almost due." With a frightened look at the clock, our strange visitor literally ran to the door and disappeared. Well, said Holmes, after an interval of silence, "Mr. Gibson seems to have a nice, loyal household. But the warning is a useful one, and now we can only wait till the man himself appears." Sharp at the hour, we heard a heavy step upon the stairs, and the famous millionaire was shown into the room. As I looked upon him, I understood not only the fears and dislike of his manager, but also the execrations which so many business rivals have heaped upon his head. If I were a sculptor and desired to idealize the successful man of affairs, iron of nerve and leathery of conscience, I should choose Mr. Neil Gibson as my model. His tall, gaunt, craggy figure had a suggestion of hunger and rapacity. An Abraham Lincoln keyed to base uses instead of high ones would give some idea of the man. His face might have been chiseled in granite, hard-set, craggy, remorseless, with deep lines upon it, the scars of many a crisis. Cold grey eyes, looking shrewdly out from under bristling brows, surveyed us each in turn. He bowed in perfunctory fashion as Holmes mentioned my name, and then with a masterful air of possession he drew a chair up to my companion and seated himself with his bony knees almost touching him. "Let me say right here, Mr. Holmes," he began, "that money is nothing to me in this case. You can burn it if it's any use in lighting you to the truth. This woman is innocent, and this woman has to be cleared, and it's up to you to do it. Name your figure." "My professional charges are upon a fixed scale," said Holmes coldly. "I do not vary them, save when I remit them altogether. Well, if dollars make no difference to you, think of the reputation. If you pull this off, every paper in England and America will be booming you. You'll be the talk of 2 continents. Thank you, Mr. Gibson. I do not think that I am in need of booming. It may surprise you to know that I prefer to work anonymously, and that it is the problem itself which attracts me. But we are wasting time. Let us get down to the facts. I think that you will find all the main ones in the press reports. I don't know that I can add anything which will help you, but if there is anything you would wish more light upon, well, I am here to give it. Well, there is just one point. What is it? What were the exact relations between you and Miss Dunbar? The Gold King gave a violent start and half rose from his chair. Then his massive calm came back to him. I suppose you are within your rights and may be doing your duty in asking such a question, Mr. Holmes. We will agree to suppose so, said Holmes. Then I can assure you that our relations were entirely and always those of an employer towards a young lady whom he never conversed with or ever saw, save when she was in the company of his children. Holmes rose from his chair. I am a rather busy man, Mr. Gibson, said he, and I have no time or taste for aimless conversations. I wish you good morning. Our visitor had risen also, and his great loose figure towered above Holmes. There was an angry gleam from under those bristling brows, and a tinge of colour in the sallow cheeks. What the devil do you mean by this, Mr. Holmes? Do you dismiss my case? Well, Mr. Gibson, at least I dismiss you. I should have thought my words were plain. Plain enough, but what's at the back of it? Raising the price on me, or afraid to tackle it? Or what? I've a right to a plain answer. Well, perhaps you have, said Holmes. I'll give you one. This case is quite sufficiently complicated to start with, without the further difficulty of false information. Meaning that I lie. Well, I was trying to express it as delicately as I could. But if you insist upon the word, I will not contradict you. I sprang to my feet, for the expression upon the millionaire's face was fiendish in its intensity, and he had raised his great knotted fist. Holmes smiled languidly and reached his hand out for his pipe. Don't be noisy, Mr. Gibson. I find that after breakfast even the smallest argument is unsettling. I suggest that a stroll in the morning air and a little quiet thought will be greatly to your advantage. With an effort, the Gold King mastered his fury. I could not but admire him, for by a supreme self-command he had turned in a minute from a hot flame of anger to a frigid and contemptuous indifference. Well, it's your choice. I guess you know how to run your own business. I can't make you touch the case against your will. You've done yourself no good this morning, Mr. Holmes, for I have broken stronger men than you. No man ever crossed me and was the better for it. So many have said so, and yet here I am, said Holmes, smiling. Well, good morning, Mr. Gibson. You have a good deal yet to learn. Our visitor made a noisy exit, but Holmes smoked in imperturbable silence, with dreamy eyes fixed upon the ceiling. Any views, Watson? He asked at last. Well, Holmes, I must confess that when I consider that this is a man who would certainly brush any obstacle from his path, and when I remember that his wife may have been an obstacle and an object of dislike, as that man Bates plainly told us, it seems to me— Exactly, and to me also. But what were his relations with the governess, and how did you discover them? Bluff, Watson, bluff, when I considered the passionate, unconventional, unbusinesslike tone of his letter and contrasted it with his self-contained manner and appearance, it was pretty clear that there was some deep emotion which centered upon the accused woman rather than upon the victim. We've got to understand the exact relations of those three people if we are to reach the truth. You saw the frontal attack which I made upon him, and how imperturbably he received it. Then I bluffed him by giving him the impression that I was absolutely certain, when in reality I was only extremely suspicious. Perhaps he will come back? He is sure to come back. He must come back. He can't leave it where it is. Ha! Isn't that a ring? Yes, there is his footstep. Well, Mr. Gibson, I was just saying to Dr. Watson that you were somewhat overdue. The Gold King had re-entered the room in a more chastened mood than he had left it. His wounded pride still showed in his resentful eyes, but his common sense had shown him that he must yield if he would attain his end. I've been thinking it over, Mr. Holmes, and I feel that I have been hasty in taking your remarks amiss. You are justified in getting down to the facts, whatever they may be, and I think the more of you for it. I can assure you, however, that the relations between Miss Dunbar and me don't really touch this case. That is for me to decide, is it not? Yes, I guess that is so. You're like a surgeon who wants every symptom before he can give his diagnosis. Exactly. That expresses it. And it is only a patient who has an object in deceiving his surgeon who would conceal the facts of his case. That may be so, but you will admit, Mr. Holmes, that most men would shy off a bit when they are asked point-blank what their relations with a woman may be, if there is really some serious feeling in the case. I guess most men have a little private reserve of their own in some corner of their souls where they don't welcome intruders. And you burst suddenly into it. But the object excuses you, since it was to try and save her. Well, the stakes are down and the reserve open, and you can explore where you will. What is it you want? The truth. The Gold King paused for a moment, as one who marshals his thoughts. His grim, deep-lined face had become even sadder and more grave. I can give it to you in a very few words, Mr. Holmes, said he at last. There are some things that are painful as well as difficult to say, so I won't go deeper than is needful. I met my wife when I was gold hunting in Brazil. Maria Pinto was the daughter of a government official at Manaus, and she was very beautiful. I was young and ardent in those days, but even now, as I look back with colder blood and a more critical eye, I can see that she was rare and wonderful in her beauty. It was a deep, rich nature, too, passionate, whole-hearted, tropical, ill-balanced, very different from the American women whom I had known. Well, to make a long story short, I loved her and I married her. It was only when the romance had passed and it lingered for years that I realized that we had nothing, absolutely nothing, in common. My love faded. If hers had faded also, it might have been easier. But you know the wonderful way of women. Do what I might, nothing could turn her from me. If I have been harsh to her, even brutal as some have said, it has been because I knew that if I could kill her love, or if it turned to hate, it would be easier for both of us. But nothing changed her. She adored me in those English woods as she had adored me 20 years ago on the banks of the Amazon. Do what I might, she was as devoted as ever. Then came Miss Grace Dunbar. She answered our advertisement and became governess to our 2 children. Perhaps you have seen her portrait in the papers. The whole world has proclaimed that she also is a very beautiful woman. Now, I make no pretense to be more moral than my neighbors, and I will admit to you that I could not live under the same roof with such a woman and in daily contact with her without feeling a passionate regard for her. Do you blame me, Mr. Holmes? I do not blame you for feeling it. I should blame you if you expressed it, since this young lady was in a sense under your protection. Well, maybe so, said the millionaire, though for a moment the reproof had brought the old angry gleam into his eyes. I'm not pretending to be any better than I am. I guess all my life I've been a man that reached out his hand for what he wanted, and I never wanted anything more than the love and possession of that woman. I told her so. Oh, you did you? Holmes could look very formidable when he was moved. I said to her that if I could marry her I would, but that it was out of my power. I said that money was no object, and that all I could do to make her happy and comfortable would be done. Very generous, I'm sure, said Holmes with a sneer. See here, Mr. Holmes, I came to you on a question of evidence, not on a question of morals. I'm not asking for your criticism. "It is only for the young lady's sake that I touch your case at all," said Holmes sternly. "I don't know that anything she is accused of is really worse than what you have yourself admitted, that you have tried to ruin a defenseless girl who was under your roof. Some of you rich men have to be taught that all the world cannot be bribed into condoning your offenses." To my surprise, the Gold King took the reproof with equanimity. "That's how I feel myself about it now. I thank God that my plans did not work out as I intended. She would have none of it, and she wanted to leave the house instantly." "Why did she not?" "Well, in the first place, others were dependent upon her, and it was no light matter for her to let them all down by sacrificing her living. When I had sworn, as I did, that she should never be molested again, she consented to remain. But there was another reason. She knew the influence she had over me, and that it was stronger than any other influence in the world. She wanted to use it for good." "How?" "Well, she knew something of my affairs. They are large, Mr. Holmes, large beyond the belief of an ordinary man. I can make or break, and it is usually break. It wasn't individuals only. It was communities, cities, even nations. Business is a hard game, and the weak go to the wall. I played the game for all it was worth. I never squealed myself, and I never cared if the other fellow squealed. But she saw it different. I guess she was right. She believed and said that a fortune for one man that was more than he needed should not be built on 10,000 ruined men who were left without the means of life. That was how she saw it, and I guess she could see past the dollars to something that was more lasting. She found that I listened to what she said, and she believed she was serving the world by influencing my actions. So she stayed, and then this came along. Can you throw any light upon that?" The Gold King paused for a minute or more, his head sunk in his hands, lost in deep thought. "It's very black against her. I can't deny that. And women lead an inward life and may do things beyond the judgment of a man. At first I was so rattled and taken aback that I was ready to think she had been led away in some extraordinary fashion that was clean against her usual nature. One explanation came into my head. I give it to you, Mr. Holmes, for what it is worth. There is no doubt that my wife was bitterly jealous. There is a soul jealousy that can be as frantic as any body jealousy, and though my wife had no cause, and I think she understood this, for the latter, she was aware that this English girl exerted an influence upon my mind and my acts that she herself never had. It was an influence for good, but that did not mend the matter. She was crazy with hatred, and the heat of the Amazon was always in her blood. She might have planned to murder Miss Dunbar, or we will say to threaten her with a gun, and so frighten her into leaving us. Then there might have been a scuffle, and the gun gone off and shot the woman who held it." "That possibility had already occurred to me," said Holmes. "Indeed, it is the only obvious alternative to deliberate murder. But she utterly denies it." "Well, that is not final, is it? One can understand that a woman placed in so awful a position might hurry home still, in her bewilderment, holding the revolver. She might even throw it down among her clothes, hardly knowing what she was doing. And when it was found, she might try to lie her way out by a total denial, since all explanation was impossible. What is against such a supposition? Miss Dunbar herself. Well, perhaps. Holmes looked at his watch. I have no doubt we can get the necessary permits this morning and reach Winchester by the evening train. When I have seen this young lady, it is very possible that I may be of more use to you in the matter, though I cannot promise that my conclusions will necessarily be such as you desire. There was some delay in the official pass, and instead of reaching Winchester that day, we went down to Thor Place, the Hampshire estate of Mr. Neil Gibson. He did not accompany us himself, but we had the address of Sergeant Coventry, of the local police, who had first examined into the affair. He was a tall, thin, cadaverous man with a secretive and mysterious manner which conveyed the idea that he knew or suspected a very great deal more than he dared say. He had a trick, too, of suddenly sinking his voice to a whisper, as if he had come upon something of vital importance, though the information was usually commonplace enough. Behind these tricks of manner, he soon showed himself to be a decent, honest fellow who was not too proud to admit that he was out of his depth and would welcome any help. "Anyhow, I'd rather have you than Scotland Yard, Mr. Holmes," said he. "If the Yard gets called into a case, then the local loses all credit for success and may be blamed for failure. Now, you play straight, so I've heard." "I need not appear in the matter at all," said Holmes, to the evident relief of our melancholy acquaintance. "If I can clear it up, I don't ask to have my name mentioned." "Well, it's very handsome of you, I'm sure, and your friend, Dr. Watson, can be trusted, I know. Now, Mr. Holmes, as we walk down to the place, there is one question I should like to ask you. I'd breathe it to no soul but you." He looked round as though he hardly dare utter the words. "Don't you think there might be a case against Mr. Neil Gibson himself?" "I have been considering that." "You've not seen Miss Dunbar? She's a wonderful fine woman in every way. He may well have wished his wife out of the road, and these Americans are readier with pistols than our folk are." "It was his pistol, you know." "Was that clearly made out?" "Yes, sir. It was one of a pair that he had." "One of a pair? Where is the other?" "Well, the gentleman has a lot of firearms of one sort and another. We never quite matched that particular pistol, but the box was made for two." "If it was one of a pair, you should surely be able to match it." "Well, we have them all laid out at the house, if you would care to look them over. Later, perhaps, I think we will walk down together and have a look at the scene of the tragedy." This conversation had taken place in the little front room of Sergeant Coventry's humble cottage, which served as the local police station. A walk of half a mile or so across a wind-swept heath, all gold and bronze with the fading ferns, brought us to a side gate opening into the grounds of the Thor Place estate. A path led us through the pheasant preserves, and then, from a clearing, we saw the widespread, half-timbered house, half Tudor and half Georgian, upon the crest of the hill. Beside us there was a long, reedy pool, constricted in the centre where the main carriage drive passed over a stone bridge, but swelling into small lakes on either side. Our guide paused at the mouth of this bridge, and he pointed to the ground. "That was where Mrs. Gibson's body lay. I marked it by that stone." "I understand that you were there before it was moved?" "Yes. They sent for me at once." "Who did?" "Mr. Gibson himself." The moment the alarm was given and he had rushed down with others from the house, he insisted that nothing should be moved until the police should arrive. That was sensible. I gathered from the newspaper report that the shot was fired from close quarters. "Yes, sir, very close." "Near the right temple?" "Just behind it, sir." "How did the body lie?" "On the back, sir. No trace of a struggle, no marks, no weapon. The short note from Miss Dunbar was clutched in her left hand."